Hi, today Ankit is going to demonstrate the Lab 6. So basically in the Lab 6 we implemented the inter-process communication where we see that the server is communicating with the client, sending some messages and then receiving some response. So first of all I will go over the code, then after that I will just demonstrate like how the basically it works. So starting from here, so here I have just like declared the required variables and included like all the standard libraries that I will need. So here we are trying to create a socket. So here we are using like AF Unix. So basically we are creating a Unix domain socket which allows us to basically processes to communicate within the same machine. And then we are using the sock basically stream and then we're setting it to 0. So basically it's just trying to create a socket and then we checking if it's -1, it means there is an error, so we just print the error and exit. But otherwise, so here first we are trying to do is, so we have declared an array here for the, not an array, basically a structure with the server address. So we are just initializing it to 0 so that it doesn't have any partial data. Then we're just setting the address family to the AF Unix because we're using Unix domain socket. And then what you're trying to do is we are trying to copy the socket path which is given. So like the temps lab6, we are trying to copy it into basically the sun path, which is going to be the address path. So basically the socket path, or basically it's basically acts like an IP address. So basically if somebody tries to connect to the socket or is trying to communicate to the socket, it's kind of like as the address for that socket, something like that. So basically if a client wants to make a connection to the socket or the server socket, it needs to basically knows that particular address, right? It just acts like an IP. So here what you're trying to, if there is any existing socket file, we're just trying to unlink that. Then what you're trying, we are just binding the socket. So here we are trying to bind the socket to that particular address, thus which we saw here /temp/lab6. So we are just trying to bind it to that. If it's equal to -1 like an error, it will just exit there. And then we're trying to listen for the connections. Again we're using the listen function here. So we are trying to listen to this server basically file descriptor which we created like a socket. And then we are waiting for the client connection. So here we are trying to accept, so it is now waiting for the client. So whenever we run the client, we'll see like when I demonstrate, it's waiting for the connection. If it's client fd, if it's equal to -1, it means there is again some error, but otherwise we say like the client basically get connected. So now here we will try to send different commands. Like for example, we are sending the PID, so it's just using str copy to the buffer. Buffer is just an array, and then we are printing it, and then we are using the write function. So what we're trying to do is we are trying to use the write function to send that command or basically that particular data to the client, because client is basically described by the client file descriptor. And then again we are waiting for the response, so we are using the read function. And similarly we are just sending other command like sleep, and then we wait for the response, and then we send another command. And finally we just close it, and yeah, we just clean up and close basically the connection. So let's see basically what does the client do. So similar, first of all we are creating a socket for the client. Again we're using AF Unix for the Unix domain sockets. And then what we're trying to do is we are using setting up the server address. So here again initializing it to 0 and then setting up the address family. And then finally what we're trying to do is we are trying to copy the socket path, because for the client to connect to the server, it needs to have that path. So we are just using a kind of a macro to store that path. And yeah, so basically we are trying to set up the server address here so that the client can connect to that particular address. So now we're using the client, we're using the client file descriptor and the server address. So whichever we created that structure, and then we're now connecting the client to that particular address, the server address basically. And then it's connected, and then we're using an infinite loop here. So basically here the client is waiting for a command here. So whatever the server sends us, we read it and then we store it in a buffer. Then we're seeing if it's PID, if it's like, so if it's PID, what we do is we print, so basically sn printf. So what we do is, so we use the get PID function to store the PID of the current process, basically the client, in this buffer. And then we're using the write command to send it back to the server. So using the write to send it back to the server. And then again we are using, so basically here we are just comparing if it's PID, if it's sleep, or if it's basically quit or something like that. And then again we are just cleaning it up. So now I will just demonstrate how it basically works. So I will just compile it first. So I have all the files here, so I will just use the make to compile it. So it's compiled. Let's first run the server here. So you can see it's waiting for the client connection here, because the accept function just waits until it gets a client. And then here what I use is I use the client. So we'll see when I run the client, it will try to connect to the server, and we see the communication happening between both of them. So if I use client, So basically we can see, so here server has sent the sleep command, but now it's waiting for the response. So once it gets the response, it just exits. Okay, so that's the thing. So let's see. So here what we say, it says sending command PID. So client received basically, and we saw in the sleep one that the server was actually waiting for the response before it can send the other command. So after sleep, it sent the quit command. So and we said the quitting, and then we just say just client basically disconnected. So that's basically how the communication happened between them. So it's like an inter-process communication. So we are just exchanging data in the form of commands and response and everything. So that was it. So if I want to evaluate myself out of the presentation, I would say I can give me like 8 or 9 out of 10. The reason being is that I understand most of the things, how basically it works, how we are setting up the server address and everything. Maybe I just lack a few in-depth details. So yeah, that was from my part. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.